right, well, let's get started. Hope your week's been going well. We're halfway there, so hang on. We're continuing our study, Words That Matter. We're walking through specific words that I think are significant and important to the storyline. Words that we have heard and used many times. And we're taking the time to look a little more in depth. What's the meaning of the word? Some of these words are religious in nature. We don't use them on a kind of day-to-day. And so we're trying to look through or walk through the last 2,000 years of history that carries a baggage, that imposes meanings upon words, as words have a kind of a social construct in nature, and what those meanings are. So we're trying to get through all that and get back to what the authors had in mind, what's the biblical definition to those words, and then by doing so, hopefully make modern applications of what those words mean or should mean for us today. So we've looked at a couple different words. We looked at the word holy. We also looked at the word spirit, and then we also mashed those two together a little bit, the importance and significance of that. Today we're going to talk about another word that's quite common, the word sin, and sinners and sinning. You know, when we think of the word sin, like I said, it's often used in a religious context. It carries kind of a moral implication and baggage. The idea of evil, of transgression, of against God. There's kind of a judgment implied upon the use of the word, right? If we call somebody a sinner, there's already a negative connotation and implication there. Well, let's walk through that word. We're going to look at the meaning of it, the Hebrew meaning, and then we're going to look at kind of in the Greek there in the New Testament, so a little old and new, and we're going to see that actually those meanings are synonymous and overlap, and then we're going to end the class tonight with some applications in Jesus. So the Hebrew word for it is the word hata. The K there is silent, so it's hata, and it literally means failing or missing the mark or missing the goal. And the Greek word for it, hamartia, which is to err or miss the mark. So, I mean, it's almost the exact same thing. They're just two different languages of saying the same word. So, missing the mark. Let me show you how that word is used in a couple examples of the Old Testament where it's not translated in English sin. But it could have, because it's the same word. Judges 20:16. So in the book of Judges, we have the Israelite tribe of Benjamin, who trained a small army, Barry, you appreciate this, of slingshot experts to never miss. And the way it says in chapter 20, verse 16, among all these soldiers, there were 700 select troops who were left-handed, so I mean, really specific there, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Or really it should say, and not sin. Which would change the meaning, wouldn't it? Would be like, so they can hit your head, but they're also not sinners. But that's really not what it just means. They never missed, so they never sinned. Maybe SWAT, you might want to have a little kind of old school left-handed slingshot. Hey,
I've not seen that enough.
You don't think that's coming? I mean, if they can miss that hair sticking up, if they can hit that hair, that I'd say that's pretty impressive. I don't know why left-handed. Maybe that's more accurate, but so they just never sinned. Right? They never missed. In Proverbs, the sage warns against making hasty decisions, or one might miss the way. So in Proverbs 19:2-3, it kind of gives first the premise behind it. Desire without knowledge is not good, right? You have a lot of, anybody ever make an impulse buy? Yeah, that's not good according to Proverbs. That's right. That's what it's saying. Impulse buys, no good. How much more will hasty feet send the way, or literally miss the way? So if you're making decisions on impulse, that means you're hasty. So then they make an application. A person with a hasty tendency or an impulse buyer might be so hasty that they miss the right path to choose. They don't choose correctly. Thus they sin. Not what's the moral implication, or there's not necessarily a judgment of character. It is a literal missing the mark, or missing the path, or failing to make the best choice. Well, so if sin literally just means miss the mark, right? We're just not very good at, we're not sharpshooters. We need to practice more. What would be the implication then when we talk about our spiritual life? How does missing the mark, why is that a problem? Now, if you got an army and you want to be winning, so you better hit your mark, right? We don't want a bunch of sinners in that slingshot troop. But what would it mean? What does that mean then for the application of a life of faith?
We're missing God's mark.
That's right. And what mark is that? If you go to a range, they have the silhouette, depending what you get. Could be a zombie if you're into that. That's what I prefer. It could be, a silhouette, but they have, you know what you're shooting at. Right? I took my brother once, and I think he watched too many movies. First, so I'm all about telling about safety and just how to work the gun, point down range, keep your finger off the trigger, all these things. And so he takes a couple shots, and he goes, yeah, just fill up, put more bullets in there. So it's like, okay. So he's over there, and then he just goes, bah, 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 bullets flying everywhere. I'm like, we'll be done with that. So then he goes, yeah, that was cool. So I was like, hold that thought. So I press the little button, I pull it off. I go, yeah, you scared it. Like nothing. Nothing. But looked good, I guess. So on that day, my brother sinned a lot. Really sinned. He, hatad a lot. So what is the goal? What are we missing? Right? What are we missing?
Philippians 2 says our attitude should be like Jesus.
Okay, so Jesus, obviously we're going to get to Jesus, but hold those thoughts. But yeah, so Jesus is going to come to illustrate really in a very human way, human experience, what we're missing. I mean, not to always go back to Genesis, but I think that's where we start, right? What are we missing? What is Genesis introducing that is foundational? Because Genesis chapter 3, humanity starts missing the mark, right? There's this other creature there, the serpent. It's crafty. It does a lot of spinning. It really uses kind of the wordings that God uses, but twists it. Like politics, really, I think started there. But what is being missed? Well, in Genesis chapter 1, we got at least three things really worth noting. I put one here, chapter 1, verse 27. The idea of God created us to be image bearers, right? So we're created to be in this physical realm, a manifestation, an expression of what God is cosmically. We're his representatives. this would have been another interesting word, but I don't have that on my list, so I'll just say it. The word translated image image of God, is the same word that is translated in other places of the Bible for the word idol. When it says, thou shalt have no idols, it's the same word. So why all these other gods, real or imagined, they had their idols, right? Their manifestations. They had a stick, a stone, some human thing with a beetle for a head. Like they had all these, a dog, whatever it was. They had all these representations. Why does Yahweh not have one of those? Why can't we represent Yahweh? I don't know. Okay, yeah, so he doesn't want us to worship something that's a very loose, sad, limited reflection of him. There's another reason.
It's supposed to be us.
Because there's already an image of God, us. So it's the same word. Image or idol is just a matter of the application. So that's part of what we're missing. We are to be the representation of God, but we kind of sucky at it. The other two things in Genesis chapter 1 and in chapter 2. Chapter 1 presents this idea that we are to be the image of God, to rule as God rules. So the way God rules cosmically, right, in Genesis, the way he rules is pushing chaos out and landscaping that voidness into beauty and purpose and harmony. So we're to do that here as God did in the garden. So don't think of the garden as all of what we call earth. The way the garden is described is there's the center, where's the tree of life, and the tree of good and evil is somewhere as you go there. So maybe around that center. So there's the tree of life, tree of good and evil around there somewhere. And then around it is a garden, not of Eden, but in Eden. We translate that wrong. So the garden is in a geography that's called Eden. And then there's something beyond that geography where Adam and Eve are later kicked out into, which is kind of this imagery of waste and wild is still out there. So what God did in the garden was an example of what Adam and Eve and humanity was to keep out doing. But we didn't do a good job of that. We actually go out and promote, this craziness. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, he uses wording of landscaping. We're supposed to care for the ground, right? So we're supposed to minister, care, nurture, add beauty to the world, which we're also not very good at. So we're at least missing those 3 words. And then we go from there. That make sense? Right, so let's look at a few other problems. In our second point there is we're failing to hit the mark. Sadly, it's a generational problem. There's so many things we could pass from generation to generation, some good, apparently some bad. And a bad thing that we pass on is this ability to sin, to miss the mark. And I don't mean we're like original sin and you're born sinful. That's not the point I'm making. But we get to remake the choices that Adam and Eve made, but we keep failing at it nonetheless. One example of that is Cain. So Cain and Abel, the next generation, what do they get to do? Well, they get to remake that Genesis 3 decision. The tree of choice continues on in different imageries, and Cain has that moment of choice. Abel makes the right choice, which approaches him to God. Cain, out of jealousy and envy and self-centeredness, finds a way to spin it in his head where he's validating the fact that he can kill his brother. So he justifies that. It wasn't an impulse, right? Which we even have laws that kind of maybe a little easier sentencing if it's just an impulse, spare the moment kind of thing. This is planned and premeditated because God has a chat with him first. So this isn't out of rage. And here's the conversation, Genesis 4, 6 through 7. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what's right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what's right, missing the mark is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." And it kind of gives you this wild animal image that is just looking to pounce upon you. This kind of intense creature that is just in the dark, hiding in the tall grass, just looking to lunge upon you. And it's the tendency to want to miss the mark. You don't go to the gun range with the intent to miss the mark. You don't have to. Does one have to practice to miss the mark? Is that a thing? I don't think that's how it works. Y'all don't do that, right, Barry? Like police, SWAT, y'all don't practice to miss the mark. But somehow we're just good at it, right? It's just wanting to pounce upon us, this tendency to miss the mark. And the way it happens in part is because evil is just crafty. It's not that you can see the mark and you're just doing what my brother was doing, just shooting everywhere. It's somehow that evil moves the mark. Like there's these alternative places that look like you're shooting in a good direction, in the right direction. And what's the very next thing Cain does? Oh, and then he calls his brother out to the field. And then he bashes him over the head, right? And takes upon himself life and death, which is supposed to be something of God, that God is in charge of. He basically repeats the sin of his parents. And death is still the consequence. And death is the consequence. It's also not just a generational problem, it is a relational problem. It's a relational problem. And, well, let me read the verse 4 first, and then I'll make this one statement. So here we have Joseph, the story of Joseph. He's been sold into slavery by his selfish brothers, his jealous brothers. First they were going to kill him, and then they thought, oh, that might be slightly too intense. Let's do the next best thing, right? And then, so they sell him into slavery and lie to the parents, or at least to the father. I don't know what else they told the mothers. But so he's sold into slavery, and he ends up there at Potiphar's house, and he actually rises to second in command. I don't think like he's the top bathroom cleaner of the house, right? Like he's managing the affairs, the estate. Almost, it's more that than he just gets to be the best cleaner. So he rises in influence, and Mrs. Potiphar is a lonely woman. Mr. Potiphar is gone a lot, keeping the empire safe because he's the captain of the guards, or keeping the politician safe. And so she's lonely, and here's this young, handsome, good-looking guy. And here's where we pick up in the story. She keeps coming after him. And after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am." Well, that's slightly arrogant. But what is he saying? Here's his reasoning why the answer is no. Because my master, right, the one who owns me, is already not a positive thing. He has entrusted me in spite of all the differences. I'm a foreigner. I'm not from around here. I'm not an Egyptian. I'm a slave. It's not a good setting. Yet somehow he has earned the trust of Potiphar, and Potiphar trusts me with everything. My master has withheld nothing from me except you. What sounds appropriate? Because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and miss the mark against God? So he starts out explaining why he can't do this against Potiphar, but in reality he then says, I can't do this against God. So in his mind, sin against people, when you miss the mark in how you're supposed to treat others, you are in reality missing the mark on how you're treating God. Well, that gets complicated, right? Because we are image bearers of God. So the way I treat you is the way I'm treating a representative of God. And on top of that, I'm also a representative of God. So there's two missing the marks there. I'm missing the mark of what God wants me to be as an image bearer of God. And then I'm missing the mark on how he wants me to treat you, an image bearer of God. So there's a whole lot of sinning, a lot of hatah going on when that happens. And how horrible are we at that? I mean, it's just it doesn't matter what. It could be color, it could be politics, it could be sports teams, it could be no matter what, we find ways to mistreat each other. It doesn't matter. It can be a gun, a rock, a knife, baseball bat. We'll find a way to be horrible to each other. We just, it's like a talent that apparently we all have. We're good at missing the mark. We're just good at missing the mark. It's also a problem of deception, right? Sin is more than this, just a list of things one should not do. It's more than just a list of bad. It's really the core of it is this ability for us to spin things, and that spinning allows us to nurture the illusion that we are qualified to create our own realities. That we get to decide what's good, right, like we're capable of that. If you think just if you have children, or you were a child once, remember when you rolled your eyes at your parents like they were stupid? And like at the sweet age of 8, I got this, right? And I couldn't even, I think I was still in diapers. Like, what ability do I have to make any decision? But I act as if I do. There's just something about, I can do this. And we really can't. We're horrible at it. We're horrible at deciding. A reoccurring sentence throughout Judges is, and they did what was right in their own eyes. And then let me tell you about the horrible mess that followed. The book of Kings, and they did right in their own eyes. Then here comes a horrible 40 years of reign. Hey, at least we can get them out 8 years tops, right? Think about 40 years. Well, that'd be a nightmare that wouldn't end. So it's just, and they did what was right in their own eyes. Same thing Adam and Eve did, same thing Cain did, same thing we all do. So Proverbs 14:12, this is why we do this. This is a part why we do this. The house of the wicked will be destroyed, but the tent of the upright will flourish. We're like, yay! As if like, yay, we're the upright. Why would anybody intentionally select a path that is going to bring pain, suffering, death, and destruction? Do you know anybody that wakes up in the morning and says, yep, today is a great day to be a fool? Anybody? Like, do you remember when you were young and you were trying to decide what you wanted to be? Anybody had that in mind? Mommy, when I grow up, I want to be stupid. Like, said no one ever. But somehow that's what we do, and here's why. There's a way that appears to be right, but in the end, it leads to death. That's the reason. There's a spinning that goes on. There's a craftiness that evil can just magically make things look good. It just makes it look right. And we're naive enough to buy it. We're impulsive enough to buy it. We don't take deep look. We don't read the labels. We don't go deep into the consequences, the cost, or the fine print. We're just like, oh yeah, I can have this, yeah, and you just give them your card and you walk out. You know, we're not good at measuring the cost. We're not good at looking deep into it. So, because of that, we take paths that seem right, but in the end, it costs a lot. Like death is the payment. It's what Adam and Eve got themselves into, and that's what we get ourselves into on a daily basis. So how do we work through all that in Jesus? Jesus, right? Well, once again, we need to realize that the problem is not out there. The problem is that person you look at in the mirror. You know, early in the morning, where you're like, how you doing? Or some of you are like, what's going on? You know, that's the problem. That person. It's the enemy within. It's the hamartia tendencies that we have that enslave us. We're still, it's a force that messes with us, and we're either too naive, we're too weak, or we're too easily distracted to do something about it. The way Paul puts it in chapter 7 of Romans, verse 15 through 17, he says, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do. But what I hate, I do. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is good. As it is no longer I myself who do it, but it is the missing the mark that lives within me. He's quite wordy. What is he saying? If I stop to think about it, I'm like, oh, here's the kind of human I want to be. I want to be kind. I want to be compassionate. I want to be happy. I want to be lovely. I want to be cheerful, peaceful, whatever. Yet we walk out the door and we're not that. We're the very opposite of those things. I don't think I ever drove home from work and thought to myself, I'm going to be mean to my wife and a horrible father. I just can't wait to get home. But then I walk in that door and it never plays out the way I thought it would in my head. Like I'm going to come in and like, dear Father, just hugs at the door. And I'm going to kiss my lovely wife. And she's just going to be like, and my children will be like, oh, Father, we could have waited for you to come. And we're going to play, and we're going to laugh. It's never like that. That's right. I walk in, So it's not because I don't want it to be good, and it's not because I don't plan for it to be good. And it's not even for lack of rehearsing it in my head. It's just once I walk through that door, there's also just me missing the mark. And then I'm rude, and then I'm, cranky. Thank you. Becky is not allowed to return to class. My examples are so much better when she's not present.
You're the one that invited me.
Yes, I know. And then there's regret. It's like there's something happening inside, right? There's just something inside. Well, the good news is that Jesus comes not as some mystical, almighty power of God that floats around zapping all the sinners and bringing judgment upon those that deserve it, because, might as well just burn everything. He comes in the human condition, claiming to be not just human, but human with the presence of God, like Genesis portrays humanity to be. And instead of then doing what Adam and Eve does, Genesis 3, and then all other humanity, all the rest of humanity does chapter 3 forward, he comes and lives this different experience of humanity, still exposed to the sin of everybody else, still exposed to the brokenness of a society, still exposed to injustice, violence, politics, still exposed to the mess, yet he does not miss the mark that God intended. He is kind, compassionate, peaceful, loving. His presence is about betterment. And all that is because in Matthew chapter 1, verse 27, he is God with us. He is the embodiment of a version of humanity that God intended us to be. A humanity that's not missing the mark. Interesting. He would not qualify for the versions or the definitions we have today of success, happiness, power, influencers. I despise that word. He wouldn't measure up to any of the things we think makes a good human a good human. Yet, when in John's account, chapter 14, Jesus doesn't say, I came to better articulate a truth that all the other prophets were just incapable of, phrasing. What he says, I am the truth. He is the example of what it looks like to be human without missing the mark. Right? The way everything, the way he treated people, what he did, what he said, how he faced the problems. Couple examples of that. In Romans chapter 6, Paul uses Jesus as the means by which you and I can also reach that goal. For he says, through Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, for if we have been united with him in death, right, so baptism, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. That does not just mean one day we get to be disembodied apparitions floating around in an eternity with little plump babies playing the harp. That's not what that means. What that means is on the other side of the baptism, we get to start being transformed or restored into the version of humanity that God created us to be completed and fulfilled on the other side of eternity. That's what the word sanctification means. We are being transformed towards saints, uniqueness of a humanity that has the exclusive presence of God and doesn't miss the mark. So, because of that, verse 6, for we know that our old selves was crucified with him so that the body ruled by missing the mark, by hata or harmatia here, might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to missing the mark, because anyone who has died has been set free from the tendency to miss the mark. So this isn't just because some immoral act. It's just the tendency to want to measure things by our own definitions. Hashtag whatever makes you happy is brutally wrong. It's just the essence of sin. We got to do not what makes us happy. We got to do what God created us to do and to be and to experience and to radiate. First Peter, the way he puts it is this, chapter 2, verse 22 to 24. He, Jesus, committed no hamartia, right? He committed no missing the mark. He himself bore our tendencies to miss the mark in his very body on the cross. Jesus on the cross is humanity's horrendously missing the mark of who should be punished. That's like injustice to its definition. We're that blind that we'll put the wrong person on the cross. So that we might die to our sins, right? And to live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Righteousness here is not only doing right things, it's doing right things in a relational setting. So we need to get it right in how we treat others. It's not just me, myself, and Jesus. The getting it right is how we treat others. The missing the mark is in how we treat others. It's a faith that is relational in nature. Otherwise, God would have just created humanity as one thing, one individual, one experience. That might have made it easier. I just get to hate myself, I guess, or be mean to myself. Like, it would have narrowed it down. But he created a relational experience because that's really where we really embody the image of God, in a relational setting. So how we treat others isn't just a nice thing to do. It is the way we do it right. Yes?
Just others, like in this room, or others?
All others.
Everyone.
Everybody. Anybody and everybody that bears the image of God. Actually, even according to Proverbs, the wicked mistreats animals. According to Genesis 2, the way we landscape this world also matters. Now, that starts to tap into global warming and the left and the right. You got to put that aside. It does matter how we treat creation. It does matter how we treat the created. And it especially matters how we treat each other. Yeah, otherwise we're ta-ta. So, he came to restore a broken, lost, tainted image because the current human condition, if we can at least define in summary what we've talked about up to now, is three things. One, failure to fully love God and others. Two, the inability to successfully perceive what is right and wrong. We're very, very bad at that because evil is crafty. Right? We just don't want to look deep into it. And number three, we have this lack of self-control and of this deep selfish impulse that drives our behavior. We are deeply, deeply selfish. There's a verse in Ecclesiastes, and it took me forever to be like, man, surely this can't be right. And basically the verse says, and a paraphrase is, every accomplishment humanity has is out of jealousy of something in somebody else. Everything. Like, maybe he's just exaggerating. I don't know. Maybe he's not. We do things because we compare and contrast to others. And we want to be better. We don't want to feel less. We want to feel more. We want to... Now, if it can also benefit others, that's wonderful, but I don't know. Hopefully that's not right, because that's a pretty sad description of humanity, that we're deeply, deeply selfish. So if that's the human condition, what's the solution? Can I just, side note, really has very little to do with is it okay if I go down a rabbit hole? My wife, I don't know, maybe I should. I used to think that the world was going to end either by the zombies or when the pandemic started, I was like, oh, yeah, this might be it. I'm okay with it. Apparently not. I'm thinking now it's going to be the AI, artificial intelligence. And because we're going to create it so well and so smarty pants that it's going to finally realize that the problem on this earth is but one thing: the plague of humanity. And then Skynet's going to come on, all of you that have watched Terminator, and then they're just going to start terminating. But that's, once again, besides the point. Okay, that's just an opinion.
You know, the writer of Terminator took the plot from Scripture.
Did he really?
Yeah, it's written in sheep.
Yeah, well, there you go. There might be some theology to it afterwards. Okay. Let's edit that out of the video, because when Skynet comes on, it'll probably start with this very speech I gave. And I'll be the first one out.
Arnold's coming after you.
Yes. Oh, boy. All right. So what's the solution? Either we take Skynet, right, where we're just going to wipe out humanity, which God even gave that a try. Y'all familiar with the flood? Let's wipe it all out and start with one family, where God's going to very intensely nurture that family along. Well, that sounds like a good thing, right? The very next story is this really shady story that is complicated, where Noah gets drunk and some inappropriate things happen in a cave. And you're like, aw. And then off we go again, right? So, actually, the solution as Jesus perceives it is in a conversation with a teacher of the law, a lawyer, in Matthew 22, verse 36 to 40, where the lawyer says, "Oh, Rabbi, which is the greatest commandment in the law? How do you perceive, as you think of the law, 613 points and a whole lot of commentary, it would be like asking today, what's the greatest of the amendments? Somebody might, First Amendment, the Second Amendment, depending your geography in the United States, right? And so forth. That's what's being asked. What's your political focus? Another way of asking that today would be, are you liberal or conservative? And here's what Jesus says. Actually, there's two greatest commandments, and they're deeply interchangeable and in a loop. Love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest, but wait, if you act now, you can always get number 2 at a discounted rate. Just pay separate shipping and handling. And the second one is like it. Love your neighbor and yourself. And then he goes further and really probably ruffled some feathers. And he says the entire backstory is leading to those two things. The entire, when he says there, the law and the prophets, what he's saying is that's the way they talked about the Old Testament. The entire backstory is about fixing the love for God and the love for others. Well, that sounds like that might be an important mark for us to start hitting, right? In Paul's words in Ephesians chapter 2, for in Christ, in the anointed, in Jesus, right, we have the fullness of God that lives in bodily form. Jesus is humanity done right. Not just to teach humanity, he is humanity done right. Here's the good news. And in Christ, you have been brought to fullness. He is the head over every power and authority. And you and I, in Jesus, are starting to embody what it means to be human that don't miss the mark.